Good afternoon, good evening to many of our guests. Welcome to the 15th Annual Ray Symposium. We're pleased to welcome nearly 700 colleagues who have registered, colleagues and friends from around the country for this event. I'm Daniel Robinson, Dean of the College of Pharmacy. The Ray Symposium honors Max Ray, Dean Emeritus of Western University College of Pharmacy. As professor and dean from 1996 to 2006, he created a stimulating educational environment that fosters both excellence and professionalism. His professional career was divided almost equally into pharmacy practice, association management, and education. A major focus of his work throughout his career was seeking ways in which to improve the value of pharmacy to society, and I'm pleased to say he continues in that pursuit. And thank you, Max, for joining us today. It's wonderful to have you with us. We're very grateful for the sponsors who are with us and who are sponsoring this program. Blue Shield of California, represented by Jessica Pond and Judy Shea. The California Pharmacists Association, represented by Susan Bonilla. Ralph's, represented by Lynn Lee and Lord Serrano. And Ray Utani, DO, PharmD. Each of these have been multi-year sponsors, and I can't thank you enough for your support. We do have special guests whom I'd like to recognize. President Daniel Wilson's with us, Provost and Senior Vice President Dr. David Barron. We have several Senior Vice Presidents of Western University with us today. Former members of the Board of Trustees, Linda Kranz and David Sadova, thank you for joining us. Current Board of Trustee member, Richard Bond. And we have our deans. Of course, Western University of Health Sciences has 9 different colleges, and I'm pleased to say that our deans are all on board. Paula Crone with the College of Osteopathic Medicine of the Pacific, Dee Schilling, College of Health Sciences, Mary Lopez, College of Graduate Nursing, Phil Nelson, College of Veterinary Medicine, Elizabeth Hoppy, College of Optometry, Steve Fredrickson, College of Dental Medicine, Kathy Satterfield, College of Podiatric Medicine, and Guru Betagari, College of Graduate College of Biomedical Sciences. And then there is one other VIP I'd like to recognize, and I want to thank Scott Knorr, who's the CEO of the American Pharmacists Association, for being with us this afternoon. Today's symposium is being brought to you as a Zoom webinar. As such, your microphones have been muted and questions will be entertained at the end of the presentation. Please use the chat feature at any time during the talk to communicate your questions, and I'll do my best to get to as many of them as I can at the end of the presentation. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for the 2021 Ray Symposium, Dr. Aaron Kesselheim. Dr. Kesselheim, MD, JD, MPH, is a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and a faculty member in the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics in the Department of Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Within the division, Aaron created and leads Portal, which is the program on regulation, therapeutics, and law, which studies how law and regulations influence therapeutic innovation, product approval, and healthcare delivery. Portal is now among the largest independent centers focusing on these issues in the country. Dr. Kesselheim received his medical and legal training at the University of Pennsylvania and his master's in public health at the Harvard School of Public Health. Author of over 450 publications in peer-reviewed medical and health policy journals, Aaron has testified before Congress on pharmaceutical policy, medical device regulation, generic drugs, and modernizing clinical trials. He is a member of the FDA Peripheral and Central Nervous System Advisory Committee, and he served on the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine consensus committees on addressing the opioid epidemic and bioidentical hormone replacement. At the Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics, he co-teaches a course on health policy, law, and bioethics, and organizes the monthly Policy and Ethics Consortium. And now let's turn to Dr. Eric Fesselheim, who will tell us about drug regulations in the 21st century, the FDA, policy, and politics. Dr. Fesselheim.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Robinson. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me. This is certainly the largest and most diverse audience I've had to present to on Zoom. So thanks for creating this opportunity. Let me share my screen, which I hope now is visible.
Yes.
Great. So thank you very much again. As Dean Robinson said, I'm going to talk today about a couple issues in drug regulation of the 21st century that I think provide an interesting intersection of regulation, policy, and politics. No one in our division has any personal financial relationships with any pharmaceutical company, and the funding that my research group receives right now comes mostly from a number of different private foundations and government sources like the FDA. As Dean Robinson mentioned, I lead a group called Portal, which is a research core that's focused on the intersection of law, therapeutics, and public health. We do a lot of empirical and normative research on everything related to drug policy from the development, FDA regulation of them, to the pricing and use of them. And so I just wanted to give the other members of my group a quick shout out early on. A lot of the work that I talk about today, a lot of the research that I talk about today arises from the great members of the group that we have. You can see listed here. So just to start, I think it might be useful just to take a high-level view of what the goals are of drug regulation. And for me, there are three major reasons why we have an FDA. And the important role that the FDA fulfills. So the first one is that the FDA exists to protect consumers. And the reason that the FDA existed, it was developed in the first place 100 years ago, was because of a large number of unsafe products that were being widely sold and widely used by consumers, including those with very serious illnesses. And this is a quote from the Supreme Court in 1979, recognizing that individuals with fatal illnesses, even those with cancer, should be shielded from fraudulent cures. And so, the existence of the FDA and the existence of drug regulation tries to ensure that consumers are protected from unsafe products, and that the products that they do use can have some assurance that the products will work to try to help them with the conditions that they have. Another important reason why we have drug regulation is to advance knowledge, because of the FDA, we get the drugs that we use and the devices that we use. Some of the devices that we use have clinical trials and research done about them to try to demonstrate adequate safety and effectiveness to the FDA. And you don't have to go back 100 years to know why this is important. All you have to do is look at the nutritional supplement market right now in the United States, which has been explicitly excluded by law from close FDA oversight. And there are a lot of products for which we don't know how they work. We don't know how to give them. We don't know, which patients might benefit from them. Some of them might be unsafe. And there isn't a lot of information about them, and yet it's a $30 or $40 billion a year industry. So the existence of the FDA ensures that there is information to guide how patients and physicians use prescription drugs. And then finally, the existence of the FDA helps ensure a well-functioning pharmaceutical market, because drug regulation provides a certification of drug quality that helps ensure that the better products rise to the top. And if you're a drug company, you actually want a strong FDA to try to prevent companies that may have worse products or products that don't work but do have a very good promotional strategy to outcompete you. And so the FDA helps ensure that there is some moderate level of quality across the market. The statutory standards, in order to get a new drug on the market, the statutory standards were first passed back in originally 1938 and then updated in 1962 to require that both efficacy and safety be demonstrated before a drug can reach the market. The statutory standard for efficacy is that a drug has to show substantial evidence of efficacy that arises from adequate and well-controlled investigations. And again, this was because in the decades leading up to that time, a lot of drugs have been, developed and widely sold without any evidence that they worked. And so the goal was to try to ensure that there was substantial evidence that was provided, and that substantial evidence was supposed to come from adequate and well-controlled investigations. And what is an adequate and well-controlled investigation? Well, shortly after 1962, the FDA tried to help define what an adequate and well-controlled investigation is, and I'm sure that these characteristics are not surprising to a lot of you, but an adequate and well-controlled investigation includes a study that has a valid comparison between an experimental and a control group. It employs suitable methods to assign study and control groups and minimize bias, use clear, reliable methods to define and assess responses of research participants, and various acceptable controls could be placebo controls, dose comparison, concurrent controls, active treatment controls, or even for a single-arm study, a historical control might be appropriate. So this gives some level of assurance of safety and of efficacy. And then meanwhile, you're also generating evidence relating to the safety of the product by, again, the FDA needs adequate tests by all methods reasonably applicable to show whether or not a drug is safe for use. And in the wake of these regulations, this is where the various stages of clinical development arose. And they arose in order to demonstrate the appropriate level of efficacy for FDA approval. And so, the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies that some new drugs go through is a way of trying to increasingly build up knowledge about the efficacy of a product. And then meanwhile, you're also collecting information about drug safety. So, the phase 1 trials are classically those in healthy volunteers. For most drugs, maybe a couple dozen patients. They might get one dose or small numbers of doses of the drug. The phase 2 studies are the first time you're giving the drug in the patients who need it, and you might get some glimpse of how well it works. But this is really about dose finding the appropriate dose in that group of patients. The FDA says that phase 2 trials are typically well controlled, but usually phase 2 trials are not randomized, they're not blinded, they might assess a surrogate endpoint, a change in a blood level or some kind of measurement rather than actual clinical endpoint, an assessment of how a patient feels, functions, or survives. Those kinds of more relevant clinical endpoints are usually reserved for phase 3 studies, which are your much larger, multi-hundred or multi-thousand patient studies. They can take months or even years to complete, and they're usually randomized and placebo or active controlled. So with that as the background, I want to talk about where a couple controversies have arisen in drug regulation that relate to balancing access to medications and the availability of drugs to patients, and the generation of this evidence that is critically important to all of those functions that I just talked about that regulation provides. And these controversies, have existed since before the 21st century, but are now taking on different kinds of, they're taking on different perspectives in the 21st century. And so I want to talk about these 3 different controversies in turn and talk about, where the controversies are. And then at the end, I'll present some thoughts on where to go from here. And I'm, excited to hear what your comments and questions are. So first, I want to talk about, the possibility of accessing drugs during efficacy testing, because, one of the downsides of the FDA process is that a drug requires can require a lot of testing before it's approved, and during that time, it's available mostly to the people who are enrolled in the clinical trials. Then I want to talk about the review times that the FDA takes to evaluate a product, and then the question of how much evidence is required before FDA approval. Okay, so if if we require some formal clinical testing of drugs before they reach the market, what do we do about people with life-threatening illnesses who, don't have any other treatments that we can offer them, but there's a drug that shows promise in clinical studies? What do we do about those people? And I think that most people feel some empathy for people in that situation, and feel like there is some sort of ethical responsibility that the system has to try to allow exceptions for people in those circumstances. And in fact, the FDA very quickly recognized this after the 1962 amendments, but it wasn't really until the HIV epidemic of the 1980s that we got formal expanded access pathways to allow patients to access medicines during this, who maybe don't qualify for the clinical trial during this clinical testing process. And in 2009, the expanded access had existed for many decades. It was institutionalized in 1987, and then in 2009, the system was revised to provide 3 levels of expanded access, such that individual patients can now appeal to the FDA to try to get access to products if the FDA determines that the potential benefits justifies the risks, and the treating physician determines that the probable risk from the drug is not greater than the risk for the disease. There are also 2 other levels of expanded access for broader populations of patients, but they're less often used. They're used sometimes as a bridge from the phase 3 studies to the formal FDA approval. There's been a lot of controversy, though, about expanded access and trying to get patients and trying to get the sort of patients who are at the end of their ropes and who need emergency treatment, the care that they deserve. But where is the bottleneck? And it actually isn't the FDA that is the bottleneck. The FDA is extremely permissive with expanded access requests, and in fact, the FDA approves over 99% of the expanded access requests that it gets. Of the 1,000 or so requests in the early 2010s, you can see there the numbers on how many the FDA approved. In fact, the bottleneck exists at the level of the manufacturer. A lot of manufacturers, especially smaller manufacturers, don't have expanded access programs in place to allow patients to access the drug, and in part because it's a lot of work and costs, and it diverts some of their supply, particularly if a small manufacturer may divert some of their supply that they might need for the clinical trials. Manufacturers are concerned about what happens. A lot of these people are, a lot of people who get drugs through expanded access are at death's door, and what happens if they die or have other adverse events? They're going to have to report those to the FDA, and that might show up on the drug labeling. The FDA says, by the way, we're not idiots. We know the difference between data that come to us from a expanded access versus data that come to us from a clinical trial. But nonetheless, this is what manufacturers are concerned about. They're also concerned that having a vigorous expanded access pathway might deter patients from enrolling in clinical trials. Notably, most manufacturers can charge direct costs for expanded access, but usually they don't charge because it's not very good PR to charge high prices for patients who are in the sort of extreme circumstances that patients who are requesting expanded access. There also are some issues for individual physicians. Individual physicians may not know about expanded access programs to direct their patients to. They may be concerned about liability, although there are no cases really of physicians being sued in these circumstances. And they might be concerned about the administrative burden of trying to fill out an application to the FDA. And so recently, in order to try to address that, the FDA made it even easier and created a 45-minute long application to get a drug through expanded access, or to apply for a drug through expanded access. And in 2017, the 21st Century Cures Act required pharmaceutical companies to, if they do have expanded access, to publicly list it on their website so that patients may know that it exists. However, there still is a lot of political controversy around expanded access, and most recently, in 2018, despite the existence of this expanded access pathway, Congress, at the president's urging, passed a right to try law. And these right to try laws had actually been pushed by libertarian activist groups in different states around the country first, and then they finally made their way up to the up to the federal system as well. The funny thing about the right to try law is that it's basically the same as, it basically has the same requirements as expanded access. You have to, technically you have to exhaust all of your approved options, not qualify for a clinical trial. The drug must have completed a phase 1 study and still be under active development. It has to be a life-threatening disease. Manufacturers can't charge more than the cost of development. The only difference is that you don't have to report outcomes as regularly to the FDA. And so all it is basically the same system that we have in place, just allows manufacturers to provide the drug without having to go through without an application needing to go to the FDA first. And so as a result of the fact that all it does is cut out the FDA from otherwise the same process, a lot of manufacturers, more conventional drug manufacturers, have ignored the right to try law and continue to make their products available just through expanded access. And so it's usually it seems like it's a lot of it's more likely to be the fringe companies at the edges of the pharmaceutical market that are more likely to use this pathway, and that's really not necessarily what we want as a good policy goal anyway. So this right to try law doesn't seem to have really changed any of the real issues that might continue to be a problem under this issue of right to try or expanded access. Okay, second controversy deals with extended FDA review times. And so historically, the FDA found that it did not have the amount of resources that it needed in order to conduct drug reviews as efficiently and as it might have wanted. And this came to a head in the 1980s with the deregulatory Reagan era that starved the FDA of funds, and at the same time the HIV epidemic crested. And you can see here a photograph from then of HIV activists protesting about FDA review times. And you can see there on the right a chart showing the average FDA review time in that era was about 2.5 to 3 years there in gray, as compared to the average clinical development time of new drugs of about 5 to 6 years. And so this was legitimately too long to have a drug just under FDA review. The solution that was initiated back in 1992 was the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which required manufacturers to submit a user fee at the same time that they submitted their new drug application, with the user fees then going to fund the FDA's drug review authority. And you can see here that the user fees have grown quite substantially since then, and actually were thought to be such a good idea that they were extended to medical devices in 2002, and more recently biosimilars and generic drugs in 2012. And actually user fees right now make up about 40% of the FDA's overall budget, and 80% of the FDA's drug review budget, and in fact have had the PDUFA, which also set deadlines on FDA review, to guarantee that they would review a drug within 12 months, and that was subsequently reduced to 10 months. Review times have fallen quite substantially, and where they were 2.5 to 3 years in the 1980s, now by the 2000s review times were a year to year and a half, and currently average FDA review times are about 7 to 8 months. And you can see here, this is a chart from the FDA showing that the FDA ends up approving about 80% of drug applications submitted to it, but you can see here from before PDUFA in orange to the early years of PDUFA, the early PDUFA. So Prescription Drug User Fee Act is renewed every 5 years. So PDUFA 1 is the first 5 years, PDUFA 2 the second 5 years, etc. PDUFA 4 and PDUFA 5, you can see maybe the FDA approval rate is ticking up a little bit closer to 85%, but what's really accelerating is the speed at which the FDA is reviewing products. And in fact, now the FDA is the fastest, if not, it's among the fastest, if not the fastest drug regulator in the world. This was a study of cancer drugs in the 2000s, showing the FDA review times in blue and the European Medicine Agency, or EMA, review times in red. And on the right, you can see there that new drugs are far more commonly introduced first in the United States than they are in Europe or Canada, in part because of faster speeds, in part because the U.S. is also, overall a larger market. And then also, the FDA also used to take multiple cycles to review drugs. So it used to, give the application back to the company and ask for more information. So in the 1990s, it was quite common for the FDA to only to approve drugs in the first cycle only in about a third to a half of applications. Currently, the FDA approves drugs in the first cycle of review in more like 90 to 95% of the time. But this has also led to concern about that this user fee system of funding sets up between the FDA and industry, and it's led to a worry about the closeness of the FDA and industry. And this closeness has been reinforced through each of the successive Prescription Drug User Fee Act renewals every 5 years. And so in 1997, when the Prescription Drug User Fee Act was first renewed, it required the FDA to consult with industry on the FDA's obligations under PDUFA, and explicitly calling for industry input into various reviews of various different products. When it was renewed again in 2002, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act then mandated negotiations as part of the anticipated 2007 renewal. And then by 2007 in the statute, there were 6 different references to negotiations with regulated industry. And these days, when the Prescription Drug User Fee Act gets renewed every 5 years, usually the FDA and industry start thinking about what the new FDA budget and FDA priorities are going to be for the next 5 years in closed-door meetings anywhere from 1 to 2 years before the renewal. And then they end up ultimately presenting Congress with a compromised piece of legislation that has been negotiated between the FDA and industry. And Congress usually passes that as a must-pass bill, because if the Prescription Drug User Fee Act wasn't to be renewed, then the FDA would lose so much of its budget that it wouldn't be able to continue. And I think that again, some worry that this undermines trust in the FDA because of the fact that the regulated entity is paying the regulator to do the work, and this closeness between the FDA and industry, I think, raises some concerns among some patient groups and some other public health advocates. And so, I think that it's an open question in this area of how do you maximize trust in the FDA? Now, user fees on the one hand provide a high and consistent level of funding that Congress was not or has not been able to or willing to provide. And during the government shutdown in early 2019, the commissioner of the FDA at the time invoked the existence of user fees as the reason for the FDA to be able to keep some services going. But on the other hand, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act is usually Exhibit 1 when people talk about regulatory capture or the lack of independence of the FDA in making decisions. And then, when the FDA does make decisions around particular drugs that seem to be more favorable to industry, this concept of regulatory capture is often invoked. And I just want to point out that trust in the FDA is an extremely important ethical and regulatory principle. And this is a graph from August, from the fall of last year, asking patients whether or not they would agree to be vaccinated against COVID-19. And you can see here, this September to October time was around the time when the president was making statements about how we're definitely gonna have a vaccine by the election, and it seemed like was putting excessive pressure on the FDA to approve a vaccine. And once you start losing trust in the FDA, then you can see the public willingness to accept an FDA authorized product like a vaccine fall quite substantially. And so really the willingness of people to engage with important products like vaccines really depends in some part on the trust that they have in the FDA. And so maintaining this trust, I think, is a really an essential component of thinking about FDA policymaking going forward. Okay, so then my third and final controversy that I want to talk a little bit about is how much study does a drug need before the FDA approves it? And the FDA has generally interpreted the statute to prefer 2 adequate and well-controlled studies, each convincing on its own, in order to generate substantial evidence of efficacy. And the reason for that is that any single trial may be subject to unanticipated, undetected systematic biases. And so if you're looking for substantial evidence, if that's the statutory standard, substantial evidence that the drug has a certain efficacy, then substantial, what reaches that level? Substantial evidence, you know, is you know, being able to replicate the clinical trial that you've shown, you know, suggests some, you know, some efficacy. However, it's also the case that if the more evidence that you require leads to additional cost in the, you know, amount of, you know, clinical trials are extremely expensive. It leads to, you know, delays because clinical trials take time. You know, circling back to the issue of patients not being able to access a product while it's under clinical study except through expanded access. Some groups have claimed that it infringes on patients' personal autonomy, and that, you know, some groups, particularly the pharmaceutical industry, has argued that excessive upfront testing is a drag on innovation. And you know, I think that over time, it's been pointed out that that you know, ethically, there are certain diseases or conditions, particularly those with unmet medical need, in which the patients who have those diseases may accept more risk. And they might be like, look, you know, we understand that substantial evidence of efficacy is a standard, and we appreciate this idea that, you know, you want to replicate and make sure that the drug actually works. But, you know, we have a serious disease, and this drug shows promise, and, you know, let's you know, come up with a, you know, some flexibilities to allow our drug on the market. And in fact, in response to this, over the last, you know, in the 1980s and 1990s, the FDA and Congress created a number of different expedited pathways that drugs are able to go through to get approved on the basis of less evidence. And so you know, the 1988, the fast track pathway was created to allow drugs to be approved on the basis of a single phase 2 trial. Again, phase 2 trials usually just test results in surrogate endpoints or biomarkers, but it was supposed to be limited to serious or life-threatening diseases. Accelerated approval allows the FDA to approve a drug on the basis of a surrogate measure that is only reasonably likely to predict actual clinical benefit. Again, drugs are allowed to be approved based on surrogate measures, but usually those surrogate measures are supposed to have a tight connection between an actual clinical endpoint. Accelerated approval is for, you know, even less clear surrogate measures. Priority review was set up in the Prescription Drug User Fee Act to give an FDA a 6-month deadline for drugs that are offered that offer a therapeutic advance. And most recently in 2012, the breakthrough therapy designation was created for drugs treating serious or life-threatening disease with preliminary clinical evidence of substantial improvement over existing therapies, although that preliminary clinical evidence can be observed in biomarkers or predictive toxicology and not necessarily in actual patient outcomes, real patient outcomes. So we've actually looked at this, the use of expedited pathways over time, and what you can see is a relatively rapid increase over time. The x-axis on that left chart is actually the same x-axis as on the right chart, but you can see there a growth over time in the average number of expedited pathways that new drugs qualify for. And on the right, you can see that the number of new drugs that qualify for at least one of these expedited pathways has also increased over time from about 30% to now, you know, in 2013, about 60%. And then, well, we were like, well, maybe that's because it's just that there are a lot of like really important new drugs coming to the market. And so we separated out drugs into first-in-class and non-first-in-class drugs. And you can see the first-in-class drugs there in the red dotted line have been qualifying for, on the right, have been qualifying for expedited pathways pretty consistently since the beginning. It's really the growth in non-first-in-class, arguably less innovative products that have more likely qualify for expedited review. And actually, these are all the drugs approved in 2017, and all the different expedited pathways you can see that they qualify for. And so these days, about 2/3 or even 3/4 of new drugs qualify for an expedited pathway. And so some people have wondered whether what was supposed to be the exception is now really the rule. And this has, in addition, and so this has become part of a long-standing observation that the efficacy standard that the FDA uses to approve new drugs has been becoming more and more flexible over time. In fact, Congress changed the statute in 1997 to explicitly allow efficacy to be proven on the basis of one adequate and well-controlled clinical investigation, in case the FDA was trying to be a little bit too much of a stickler about 2 clinical trials. Now, Congress actually changed the law so that one adequate and well-controlled trial is enough. And in fact, if you look at pivotal trials in the 1990s versus the 2010s, you can see that the proportion of new drugs supported by at least 2 pivotal trials has fallen from 80% to 50%. The proportion of approvals based on at least 1 pivotal trial that used an active comparator as opposed to a placebo control or a historical control in a single-arm study fell from 44 to 29%, and the proportion of approvals based on non-randomized studies with only a single intervention group increased from 4 to 17%. And at the same time, there has been greater reliance on surrogate measures of all kinds. And of course, there are, of course, advantages to surrogate measures, including the ability to identify drug safety problems and predict efficacy sooner. But if you look at pivotal efficacy trials in the 2000s as compared to those in the 2010s, the number approved based on surrogate measures has increased from 45 to almost 60% now. And this is provides a lot less clear understanding of what drugs actually do once they reach the market. And this is a study published in 2015 looking at cancer drugs, finding that about 2/3 of cancer drugs are approved based on surrogate endpoints, and only 1/3 were approved based on showing changes to actual overall survival, which is, of course, why we give cancer drugs, to try to extend survival of patients. And then these authors looked at this gray bar, so some years afterwards, and looked to see how many of the drugs in this gray bar actually had actual overall survival demonstrated after approval. And you can see there that only about 15% had actual overall survival demonstrated. A full half of them, none of these did not have showed no improvement in overall survival, and for 1/3 of them, we still didn't know what effect these drugs had on overall survival. And this is a study that we did showing also that when you approve drugs on the basis of an expedited pathway, that leads to an increased risk of safety-related labeling changes afterwards. And so if you look down here, among the boxed warnings or contraindications, there was an almost 50% increase in changes to the boxed warnings or contraindications sections of the drug labeling after approval for expedited drugs as opposed to standard review drugs. And we did that based on matching expedited standard review drugs. Again, these are risks that you might want to take as a patient, but you would probably only want to take them for a truly innovative, important new product, and you may want to make sure that patients actually know about these changes. There has been substantial problems with the implementation of some of these pathways. For example, accelerated approval, as I mentioned, is a pathway that allows approval of drugs based on these really very unvalidated surrogate measures. And the idea is that the drug company is supposed to conduct a confirmatory trial after the drug is approved. And so we looked at drugs approved through accelerated approval from 2009 to 2013, and found that nearly 40 post-approval studies were required, but by about a minimum of 4 years later, only about half of them had been completed, and a slightly fewer number of that published. And then when you look at the trials themselves, again, only half of those trials are randomized, and most of them used surrogate measures as endpoints for these confirmatory trials. So again, the drug's on the market, and yet it's still being tested in surrogate measures. And this was another more comprehensive review of cancer drug approvals approved through accelerated approval, looking at the characteristics of those post-approval studies. And what we found was that even though the FDA reported that a large number of them confirmed the benefit of the drug, what we found was that a relatively small fraction of these confirmatory studies studied clinical outcomes. Most of them still studied surrogate measures, about 40% there in those middle lines. And actually, about half of the surrogate measures were the very same surrogate measures that were studied in the pre-approval trials. And so it leads people to wonder what's, again, the goal of accelerated approval is to get the drug on the market and allow patients to be able to use it while still testing it. At that point, should you not be testing it in a more rigorous way to try to figure out what the drug actually does. And then more recently, what there's been concern about are what might be called zombie accelerated approvals, where the confirmatory study not only, so the confirmatory study is actually negative. It does not show any benefit in overall survival. In that case, why not just remove the indication from the market, from the labeling, or if that's the only indication for the drug, move the drug off the market? And so we published this article pointing out 4 examples of drugs where that had been approved based on an accelerated approval surrogate measure that was supposed to predict overall survival. When the study was actually tested, there was no change in overall survival. One of the drugs was actually converted on that basis to regular approval, and a number of these other drugs still had no decision made by the FDA in 2019. So in early 2021, the FDA has reviewed some of these drugs and has worked with companies to voluntarily withdraw some of their indications, and is going to have an advisory committee meeting either later this month or in early May to review another half a dozen of the zombie accelerated approvals where the accelerated approval confirmatory trial has been completed and it's negative. And in an article published in the New England Journal this week, the leaders of the FDA Office of Oncology Products pointed out that they actually take quite a lenient approach to thinking about confirmatory trial completion. And they say, look, if there are clear reasons why a trial may not have achieved its primary endpoints and an unmet medical need still exists, the FDA will work with sponsors to identify subsequent clinical trials that could satisfy the accelerated approval requirement. And I think that's exactly what the FDA should be doing. But this again then gets back to the trust that that we're supposed to have in the FDA to ensure that the FDA is doing that at a sufficient arm's length. Meanwhile, it also, I think, might make sense to withdraw the indication from the market, or at least provide some better, some better information to patients and physicians who might still be using this product, thinking that because it's FDA approved, it's therefore likely to help. Another problem has been in the breakthrough therapy designation. It turns out when breakthrough therapy is assigned to a new drug, a lot of the drugs don't actually turn out to be actual breakthroughs. And we reviewed 51 oncology drugs approved from 2012 to 2017, which about 22 received breakthrough therapy designation, a lot of them on the basis of a change in response rate or progression-free survival. None of them received a breakthrough designation on the basis of testing showing changes to overall survival. But when we looked at the outcomes that they showed, what we found is that the response rate and the progression-free survival gain does not appear to be different between breakthrough therapy labeled and non-breakthrough therapy labeled drugs. And in fact, the progression-free survival gains, it does not appear to have for only 4 out of 5 of the breakthrough drugs and 9 out of 12 of the non-breakthrough drugs appears to have a level of progression-free survival gain that might translate into what might be thought of as a clinically meaningful improvement in progression-free survival, not actually in even overall survival. But this is, potentially confusing, because then a drug can reach the market, and in the release information, the company or the FDA often reports that it was given the breakthrough therapy designation. We did this survey of physicians across the country, and we asked them this question: imagine your patient had a serious medical condition for which there's been no effective treatment. The FDA recently approved 2 new drugs to treat this condition. Both drugs will, which would you choose first? Axibex, the FDA designated breakthrough drug, or Zykanta, a drug with early promising study results but which has not been shown to improve survival or disease-related symptoms. And of course, Zykanta, this description describes a lot of breakthrough therapy designated drugs without using the word breakthrough. And it turns out, as you might expect, nearly all physicians who took this survey agreed that they would use the breakthrough therapy drug designation instead. So, I wanted to provide just some quick overall thoughts on these controversies and where do we go from here, and then open it up to questions and conversation to try to talk about some of these issues. I think it is important to provide adequate funding to ensure that a drug regulatory system serves the public effectively, and I also think that it would be optimal from a from a promoting trust point of view, to try to ensure that that funding would come from public sources. And so adequate public funding in place of user fees would allow the FDA to continue its current performance levels while promoting maximum confidence in the public. That doesn't seem to be, across past, administrations, both Democrat and Republican, doesn't seem to be something that's been, something that has been high on the agenda. Although I think that it would be a move in the right direction. We also need to have a process for making sure that we identify promising drugs in development and getting them to the patients who need them. I don't want anybody to come away with this thinking that I don't believe that flexibility is the right thing, or that I don't think that it's important to try to have some understanding of in circumstances where there is unmet medical need. But I think it's also the case that multiple expedited pathways are inefficient, confusing, and they don't seem to be being applied as rigorously as they should be to the, again, these are supposed to be exceptions from the normal pathway. We also need to make sure that we have effective evaluation of the effects of increasing use of surrogate measures. Surrogate measures have continued to grow in the way that they've, in their application to new drug approvals, and I think that they will continue to grow that way, as we learn more about, the genetic basis of a lot of diseases and find, ways of trying to adjust those, different markers and other biochemical pathways that we identify. I think surrogate measures have grown to be an extremely important part of the regulatory climate. I don't think they're given the attention that they deserve in terms of validating them. Even before approval, and then if not before approval, at least validating them after a drug is approved, to try to make sure that they're actually giving us the drugs are actually giving us the benefit that we thought. Because the history of pharmaceutical use is littered with drugs that have been approved or used on the basis of changes to surrogate measures, where those drugs have later shown to be dangerous and been withdrawn from the market, or not be as effective as we might have thought. We also need to be vigilant for the possibility that expedited development will lead to drugs that have risks that outweigh benefits, and this is a good opportunity for the use of post-approval evaluation and real-world evidence to try to enhance our understanding of drugs when they're approved. And there's been a lot of work done in this area over the last couple decades to try to better understand drug safety, and I think more formally integrating that into the regulatory process, as the FDA has been doing, and I think that is a really important is an important recent trend. And I think actually we should go even a step further and consider formally reassessing the efficacy and safety of new drugs after they've been on the market for a certain amount of time, such that we can actually really look at all the studies that have been done and try to understand whether or not the labeling of the drug needs to be changed, or whether or not in rare circumstances the drug may even need to be withdrawn from the market. And then finally, I think we need to be a lot more upfront with patients about some of these details. A lot of patients and quite frankly physicians don't know about some of the various ways that a drug can be tested in order to reach the market. That they don't know about the availability of expanded access, if it exists. And so being more open with patients about the various pathways may be useful in informing the decisions that patients make. And one of the ways that we could do that would be to better present information about drugs approval to prescribers and patients, by providing details on those products, and not leaving that up to the pharmaceutical company and the advertising campaigns that they engage in. Some investigators have suggested a drug fax box is one way of doing that. This is an example drawn up by my colleague Stephen Walsh at Dartmouth, of providing an easy to read format that might help better promote education by physicians and an understanding by patients of what benefits they might actually expect a drug to provide. Because all of these drugs, all new drugs these days are extremely expensive, and their use is a really important decision that physicians and patients need to make, and we need to make sure that they make that decision with optimal information. So those I think were my thoughts, and I am excited to hear about any questions or other thoughts that you have.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Kesselheim, for the amazing presentation and how timely. I think one of the slides that you showed the graph on trust in the FDA and very recent data back this last year. And I think we're all living that right now because we're seeing quite a bit of vaccine hesitancy. A lot of universities and throughout the U.S., people are talking about should vaccines be mandated, and there's the question of emergency use authorization that is preventing some from making that mandate. But maybe could you just address from emergency? I mean, we know that the vaccines were put through rigorous processes of testing, but they didn't get emergency use authorization, and so they're not yet FDA approved. So there's a lot of people not getting vaccinated because of that. Could you just comment on that?
Sure. I mean, I think that, unfortunately, one of the major, unfortunately, we lived through a year last year when the FDA's credibility and trust in the FDA took a number of major hits because of activity related to the emergency use authorizations for hydroxychloroquine and convalescent plasma, and a lot of political meddling in FDA decision making, and I think that has poisoned the atmosphere a little bit around these products, and I think has contributed to some of the hesitancy even now that people might be experiencing. I do think, though, that one of the and I think that emergency use authorization was created in the wake of the 9/11 attacks as it's sort of a thought as a response to potential bioterrorism. Wasn't necessarily created with a international pandemic in mind, and so you can see some of the problems with applying the emergency use authorization to this ongoing situation, because basically emergency use authorization has much more flexibility even than drug approval has, because there isn't as clear standards for things like efficacy. And so the emergency use authorization for hydroxychloroquine was provided on the basis of almost no evidence, whereas on the other hand, for vaccines, the emergency use authorization, to the FDA's credit, the FDA put out there standards for what the minimum levels of efficacy that the vaccine was going to show. That's very unusual for the FDA to do. The FDA does not usually have minimum standards for the efficacy of a product. So they put out their efficacy goals for what they expected the vaccines to reach, and then the vaccines not only reached those, they exceeded them. So I think that by the efficacy testing of those vaccines show that they are far beyond what we might expect for even some approved vaccines and the effectiveness that some approved vaccines have. So I think that part of the problem is that same emergency use authorization that applied in the case of hydroxychloroquine now is also the umbrella under which the vaccines are currently being made available as well, and that can lead to some confusion and hesitancy. And so I imagine that what's happening is that the FDA is moving quickly to ensure that they're approved through their regular pathway, and hopefully within the next few months we'll get them converted to approval. And then I think that there are other steps that we need to take to try to ensure that those really effective products are distributed appropriately.
So it's a little nerve-wracking to know that we are the fastest in terms of drug approval, and maybe that's not a great thing. If you can considering how the FDA is largely funded, by industry. So, but a question was raised, if you look at what happened in Europe, and they have a little bit longer approval process, do you see the same number of changes in black box warnings and other things post-marketing through a slower approval process?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I am not aware of studies that have looked at that, but I think that type of question might be might be of interest. And I think, to be honest, we're actually in the process right now of updating some of the numbers on the approval time trends in Europe. And I think that their EMA has taken steps to try to close the gap a little bit with the FDA. And I think that when we re-examine this past decade, we might see less stark of a difference. But yeah, I don't know of any study that has looked at that specific question, but I think it's a really good one.
The direct-to-consumer marketing, I think there's only a couple of countries that really allow that. I think it's New Zealand and the United States. And a lot of the marketing is really focused on drugs that don't necessarily have a clear advantage over another drug. They wouldn't need to market it so heavily if it was a breakthrough drug or really an outstanding product. So would you comment on the effect of direct-to-consumer marketing on decisions in drug therapy?
Sure. I mean, I think that there is good evidence that direct-to-consumer marketing drives prescribing. Pharmaceutical companies wouldn't do it if it didn't. And so, I think that there's some studies from, a few decades ago showing that companies get $4 back for every dollar that they spend on direct-to-consumer advertising. And I think that there are concerns about the messages that people get about the drugs that are the basis for the direct-to-consumer advertising, and whether or not those are, those are fair messages. But there are studies that look at prescribing and show that when patients go into their doctor's office and request a drug by name, that they're more likely to get the drug that they request. So it does have an effect on prescribing. And then some people also suggest that there are also, again, studies suggesting that that direct-to-consumer advertising can increase prescriptions for diseases that where some people may just have a normal a normal range of behavior to try to medicalize certain conditions. And that's a problem as well. On the other hand, other people point out that direct-to-consumer advertising can also help inspire conversations about certain conditions, stigmatized conditions like depression or erectile dysfunction or something like that. And in that way, direct-to-consumer advertising, there might be some positives to it as well. I think that whether or not you see direct-to-consumer advertising as a negative or a positive, under the current perspectives relating to commercial speech in the United States judiciary, I don't foresee it going anywhere. And so I think that the best thing that we can do would be to try to, ensure that it is well regulated and there is sufficient oversight at the FDA. Unfortunately, there is not enough resources that we devote to making sure that direct-to-consumer advertising is fair. But I don't foresee any effort, any successful effort to try to restrict our ability to do that.
In your conclusion, one of your conclusion slides, you did mention that sorry, I was just reading notes and trying to speak at the same time. Let's skip over to a question about the facts label. The idea of a drug product facts label. Is there a strong champion for moving toward this approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it would be a useful addition. Certainly we could also talk about to what extent it should be integrated into advertising to try to provide patients with a clear understanding of what they might expect the drug to do. But I think it's also important to integrate it into physician education and pharmacist education. So that we can make sure that people when they ask questions to their providers can get a better understanding of a drug's effectiveness and risks, and that's the goal of the facts box, is to try to synthesize important information that a patient might want to know.
Someone is asking about your opinion on how J&J should approach the COVID vaccine in light of the embolic events that have been found.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that it seems like the process, from where I sit, which is, not having any insider information, it seems like it's, it's been a reasonable process. A potentially important side effect was or a potentially important, an important potential side effect was identified as being associated with, the administration of the vaccine. And so, the FDA and Johnson & Johnson appropriately have paused it and said, well, let's investigate this a little bit. And, hopefully, I think they're working, very diligently to try to understand whether or not this is, a real thing, or it is unrelated. And then we'll see. I think that given the fact that we do have alternative vaccines that don't seem to be associated with that risk, and given the fact that, again, if we were to get this wrong and it would turn out to be a real risk that we kind of blew off early in the process, then we could really seriously undermine our ability to promote trust in the vaccine and the oversight process. I think it made sense to take a pause and to try to better understand what's going on. And this is it's a challenging time with the demand for the vaccine and the fact that all of us are want to try to get out and do more of the stuff that we used to do before the pandemic. But I think it seems to me like the process is moving in the correct direction. Ultimately, what should J&J do if it turns out that it's a real side effect? It does seem to be extremely rare. They might, there are a lot of cases where drugs have rare side effects, and we warn about them, and people can make their own decisions about it. It might also be that we find certain patient populations in which it's, more or less common, and then you sort of restrict people from in that subgroup from getting that vaccine. Again, fortunately, we do happen to have other options that we can use in its place.
We'll just go with one more question, and we're all aware that the FDA is really understaffed and underfunded to do international due diligence on manufacturing, and we get so many of our drug products from international markets. Do you have some thoughts about how we, and the pandemic made it even worse because there's, almost no on-site evaluations going on right now. Any thoughts on what the future looks like for foreign imports and our use of foreign produced drugs?
Sure. I think we're going to continue to use foreign produced drugs. We, as you said, I think that over half of our drugs right now and 80% of our active pharmaceutical ingredients start overseas. I know that there are some efforts to try to, provide different structures to encourage U.S.-based manufacturing. In Congress, they're considering different ways of thinking about that. But in the meantime, I think that we do need to have sufficient resources to ensure that there are important inspections. I think that given all of the importation that we do of drugs, I think that the FDA does a remarkable job, given the fact that the U.S. is one of the safest, if not the safest, drug supplies in the world. So I think the FDA does a remarkable job with the limited resources that it has. But of course, more resources are important. And another thing that the FDA could do, and I think has been starting to look into, is partnering with other advanced regulatory systems around the world to piggyback off of their inspections, so that you don't have to get an inspection by the U.S. and the EU and Canada and Japan and the WHO. You can figure out ways of piggybacking off of others' inspections as well. So I think there are a couple different strategies moving forward, but I think it is still worth remarking on the fact that the FDA does do an excellent job ensuring that we have a very safe drug supply.
Well, that's wonderful. And with that, I thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Excellent presentation, so timely. I think it couldn't have come at a better time for us to help us understand the drug approval process, rapid authorization, emergency use authorization, and all the different aspects and the relationship between Big Pharma and the FDA, a little bit about that as well. So thank you. I want to thank you on behalf of WesternU and our friends and colleagues across the nation. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And there were a lot more questions, but we just weren't able to get to them.
Feel free to, anybody can feel free to email me. I'm happy to try to answer questions that way.
I did want to also put in a plug to visit the portal website, because you have a fellowship program there, and I would recommend that people look at it. It looks like a very exciting program.
Yeah, it's you can find us at portalresearch.org. That's our website. You can also follow us on Twitter at portal_research. And yeah, we have a fellowship program, and if anybody is interested in that in the future, please let me know.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.